If you were to ask me what game defined the Sega Saturn for me, it would have to be Sega Rally Championship. There were a lot of games I loved on the Sega Saturn, and while Sega Rally may not have been my favourite, I definitely sunk the most amount of time into it. It was the first time I felt like the arcade had truly come home. Lots of games at the time had claimed to bring the arcade experience to console, but a lot of the time this wasn't exactly true, and in some cases it was a straight up lie. It's hard to explain how much of a big deal this was to anyone who wasn't alive in the 90s. The disparity between games in the arcade versus what we got at home was huge, and as good as some ports were, they rarely captured the magic of the arcade. I think it's safe to say that there were few arcade racing games at the time that could hold their own against Sega Rally. When it first hit the arcades in 1994, it was a big deal. Like Daytona before it, it was almost impossible to find an arcade without a machine, but unlike Daytona, it received an extremely well done conversion for the Sega Saturn, and later a port for the PC, which wasn't as well received, but still very playable. For the longest time, I thought these were the only official options for playing the game at home, but how wrong I was. In 2006, Sega Rally 2006 was released in Japan as an exclusive for the PlayStation 2. As an added bonus, the first press edition of this game also included a separately boxed version of the original arcade classic. Like many games developed in Japan in the early 2000s, there's almost no information on how it came to be or why it never saw a release outside of Japan. While this might seem strange, it was actually pretty common at the time. There are a number of Sega arcade games that were ported to the PS2 which never got a Western release. Seriously, if you want to play some of Sega's best games of the 90s, you'll want to check out the Japanese Sega Ages discs. Having spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours with the Saturn version, the prospect of a more accurate arcade port had me positively foaming at the mouth. What I wanted to know more than anything else though was, would it bring the magic of the arcade home, and could it possibly be better than the Saturn version? The short answer to the first question is yes. In terms of delivering that classic 90s Sega racer feel, it's the best official port of this game bar none. The answer to the second question is a bit more complicated, so let me explain. First and foremost, this version of Sega Rally is not the Saturn game simply emulated on the PS2. This is a straight port of the arcade game with no bells and whistles. All you get is championship mode and practice. That's it. No additional cars or tracks, no fancy menus, nothing. From a content point of view, it's exactly as it was in the arcade, for better or worse. This is where the Saturn version has the upper hand, and I'll go into more detail about how the two versions compare towards the end. It does have a very basic menu, and if you've played any of the Japanese Sega Ages discs, this will be very familiar. This menu includes some old school staples like a sound test, so you can play Game Over Yeah to your heart's content. You can customize which song plays on each stage, and it even provides some resolution options. All of them look a bit too narrow running through my scaler, particularly B, which looks like all kinds of wrong unless you force it to 16:9. Doing this actually looks pretty close to the arcade game. The problem is, you sacrifice sharpness in doing so. It's not the end of the world, but if you're a stickler for both crispy pixels and authentic resolution ratios, then this might annoy you as you can only pick one. Now, some sources claim that it's an arcade perfect port, but putting them side by side, it's clear that this is not 100% true. It is really close though. The PS2 port is running at a lower resolution, and overall it looks a bit more grainy. It's not missing any assets as far as I can tell though. Every tree and crowd member is exactly where they're supposed to be. Like the arcade, the frame rate is locked at 60 frames per second, so in motion, it's difficult to tell the two apart without sticking them side by side like this. The only obvious giveaway is the press start message instead of insert coin during the attract mode. Otherwise, this is the arcade game. It's not a bespoke job like the Saturn version, or a crime to humanity like the Outrun remake. Yuck. So, like I said, there are only two modes available. Championship, which lets you race against other cars across 4 tracks, and Practice, which lets you practice any of the 4 tracks. Oh, and you'll need to enter a cheat to select the Lakeside track in Practice. On the surface, this sounds kind of limited, and seeing that you can finish the entire game in under 4 minutes, you'd be forgiven for thinking, what's the point? Where Sega Rally Championship excels is in the gameplay. Replaying each track and trying to shave a tenth off your best lap time remains every bit as entertaining as it was 26 years ago. The game never slows down or bugs out either. In fact, there aren't even any loading screens, and if one lap doesn't sound substantial enough, you can increase this to 5. The sublime controls and the subtlety of the drift mechanic translates perfectly to the DualShock controller too. Later versions of the Saturn game, like Sega Rally Championship Plus, added support for the 3D controller, but I'd argue that the DualShock's analog stick is the definitive way to play with a pad, and if you're an OG Saturn fan, you can still play with the D-pad if you prefer. There's more good news if you're familiar with a Saturn game too. That muscle memory you spent your childhood building up, well, it'll transfer over. Every apex and change in track surface are exactly how you remember them, only now everything looks and feels much better. And I think this speaks volumes for how solid the Saturn version is. Like many Japanese arcade games of the era, most of it is in English. Annoyingly, some of the menu text is in Japanese, so you may need to Google what yes and no looks like in kanji to save your scores. The only real complaint I can make with this port is that, as far as I can tell, the Lancia Stratos isn't in it. One of the best things about the Saturn version was unlocking the Stratos, mastering its quirky handling, and then obliterating your previous lap times. There is a cheat that changes your car to two-wheel drive and increases the acceleration, just like there was in the arcade. It doesn't change the appearance of your car or the car model on the scoreboard though, so it's not really the same thing.
3, 2, 1. Go!
Okay, I've already made a number of comparisons to the Saturn version, mainly because it's the only other console port, and for those who grew up with this game, it's probably the one that you remember. So, how does it compare? Being a direct port of the arcade game and running on more powerful hardware, it should come as no surprise that both the visuals and performance of the PS2 game are miles ahead of the Saturn version. Poly counts are higher, textures are sharper, and the frame rate is much smoother. There's a lot less pop-in as well, and the draw distance again is superior. I never actually realised how limited the draw distance is on the Saturn version until now. The Saturn version still holds up remarkably well, but the higher frame rate of the PS2 version definitely gives it the edge. So in terms of the presentation and gameplay, the PS2 port is the better of the two. As I mentioned earlier though, the Saturn version has a bunch of extras that the PS2 port doesn't. The PS2 has no split-screen multiplayer, no time attack mode, and even the music is different. It has the original arcade soundtrack, unlike the Saturn version which has a bespoke Red Book audio soundtrack. After playing the Saturn version for so many hours, hearing the arcade music feels like a massive downgrade to me, but obviously this is subjective. Additionally, the Saturn version has more elaborate replays, a basic car tuning menu, and a handful of other configuration options. The only two features the PS2 has over the Saturn is, it has a rear view mirror when using the bonnet cam, and you can choose up to 5 laps in the championship mode, whereas on the Saturn it only goes up to 3. Apart from these minor differences, the Saturn version easily has it beat from a content and options point of view. For whatever reason, Sega insists on letting its collection of amazing arcade classics fade into obscurity. Sega Rally Championship is not only an excellent game, but an important milestone in gaming history. Without it, we might not have the Colin McRae's, WRC's, Dirt games, or any of the other awesome rally titles we have today. The fact that the best port of this game is largely unknown by Western audiences and is impossible to purchase on modern hardware is a travesty. This is definitely worth hunting down if you were a fan of the original, even if it's only for a few more laps around mountain. If you enjoyed this video, why not drop it a like, or conversely a dislike if you didn't. If you're new around here, hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified when new videos go live, and if you like giving money to strangers, head on over to the Patreon page. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'd like to leave you with a few ideas for how developers could improve their games using the power of Sega Rally.